Test, test. Watch out, there's a people tripper up here. Well, good morning to all of you. I'm Steve Disher, and I'm going to be talking about port knocking today. Not a terribly complicated subject, which is probably good for one of the first presentations of the morning. So a little bit about me first. For those of you that don't know me, my company is learnmikrotik.com. And we do RouterOS training, including almost all of the MikroTik certifications, with the exception of the newest one, the Internet Networking Engineer certification. And I also own a WISP, so I know your pain if you're a WISP owner as well. And my WISP has about 500 customers, and that's kind of the point where things start getting really interesting. So like I say, if you own a WISP, I can feel your pain for sure. I had a lot of questions since I've been here this week doing training about the MikroTik Roadshow that we did this summer, so I wanted just to spend maybe 30 seconds or a minute or so telling you about my roadshow. The roadshow was something we just completed. It was a 10,000-mile, 100-day journey around the western USA. We started out with a training in Dallas, Texas. From Dallas, we went out to California, up and down California 2 times. Because of poor planning on my part, and then up into Oregon, Washington. We then went over to Vancouver Island, Canada, back to the Canadian mainland, and then back down through Montana, and then back to Texas, and arrived back in Texas in August. So the purpose of the roadshow was to try and cover as many states as we could this summer doing MikroTik training and try and get as many people as we could interested in RouterOS and the MikroTik products. So by the end of the trip, we had traveled about 10,000 miles in our motorhome. We did pull a Jeep behind the motorhome, so I guess the 3,000 miles that we went in the Jeep, you can add 10 to that. So about 13,000 total in the Jeep. Obviously, there was nobody in there for 10,000 of those miles. Used about 1,100 gallons of diesel, spent a little over 100 nights on the road, visited 11 U.S. states, 3 islands, and 2 Canadian provinces. So had a really great time doing MikroTik training. We did 5 public trainings that are kind of, I guess, designated here at the bottom of the screen, as well as 6 private trainings for different companies. Consulted with 9 different companies. Some of those 9 were actually RV parks where we stayed, that where you turn your computer on and you do a scan for wireless networks and you get Linksys with no security of any kind. Those were prime candidates for people that needed MikroTik, and so we helped them out. We issued 35 MikroTik certificates through the trainings, and hope that next summer you'll watch for our next roadshow to start in the summer of 2011. And if you want to follow us, we are at mtroadshow.com. So the real purpose of my presentation today to talk about port knocking. When I was in my office talking to my staff about doing this presentation, I said, you know, I like to usually warm up the crowd, start out with a joke, so I was thinking of telling a knock-knock joke. And everybody just kind of looked down and they shook their heads, and it's like, no, please don't do that. Don't embarrass us. So I won't tell you any knock-knock jokes. We'll just go straight into the presentation. First of all, what is port knocking? How many of you have ever heard of port knocking? Okay, quite a few. Good. All right, this is not the same kind of knocking that you do as a kid when you run up to someone's door, knock, and run away. Okay, but it's a very similar concept. Port knocking is a method of externally opening ports on a firewall by generating some connection attempts on a pre-specified series of closed ports. Okay, kind of a mouthful there. But we'll break that down for a moment and talk more about what that actually is. So what is the knock? Well, the knock itself is similar to a secret handshake, where the client decides that they are going to try and open a certain series of ports in some combination within some period of time. The knock is kind of like a handshake, and it can be TCP, UDP, ICMP, or any other protocol that you can generate to try and open a port that appears to be closed on the destination machine. And if you want to further enhance port knocking, you can secure it by sending text strings. So not only do you attempt to open a port on the device, you attempt to send a text string to that port on the device, and that further complicates the handshake and increases the level of complexity and security. So here's a little bit of a graphic example of how the port knocking sequence takes place. First of all, on the left side of the slide is, in this case, a laptop. On the right side is a router. So step one is the laptop tries to create a connection to port 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'll just use some simple port numbers here so that we can make the example as simple as possible. So the router sees that connection come in, and it stores the requester's IP address for some amount of time. Next, the client tries to send a connection to port 4321. And the second time, the router checks to see if the IP address, the source address of that knock, is coming from the same address as the first knock. If the IP is the same, and if the time between the first and second attempt is within some specified window that we've configured, then the router will allow that IP address to access the router. So in order to talk about port knocking, we have to make sure we understand MikroTik's firewall chains. There's 3 default chains, and just a quick review for those of you that may be a little rusty on your firewall chains. First of all, the input chain. The input chain is used to process packets that are entering the router. Those packets are coming in through one of the router's interfaces with a destination IP that is bound to that router. Okay, so typically when we create rules in the input chain, what we're trying to do is to protect the router itself. And it's important to note that packets passing through the router are not processed against the rules of the input chain. So input chain protects the router. Next is the forward chain. The forward chain is used to process packets that are passing through the router. So I always teach my students, just remember, input chain protects the router, forward chain protects the client. And finally, the one we probably use the least is the output chain, which processes packets that are actually generated by the router itself. So again, an important note is that packets passing through the router are not processed against the rules of the output chain. So let's talk about a strategy, how we can implement this port knocking in our security of our firewalls. Well, first of all, we need to be able to detect a connection to a port and then take the source address, that is the client that sent us that knock, that tried to generate that connection, and put them in an address list. And we'll name that address list temporary, and we'll keep it in there for 10 seconds. Why 10 seconds? Well, it could be 5 seconds, it could be 1 second, just whatever you want to specify there. The point being that some period of time where you can generate the second knock. Not so long that you miss the second knock, not so short that you miss the second knock, not so long that you don't actually accomplish anything. Second, you want to detect a connection to a second port and then see if the source IP is in the list that you generated in number 1. So the knock comes in, we put them in the temporary list. A second knock comes in on the correct port, we see if they're in the temporary list. If they are, we now put them in a permanent list called secured. And then finally, we have a firewall rule that will then allow access to the router from anyone who is in the list called secured. So here's a graphic that further describes what this sequence looks like. First of all, on the left-hand side in the upper left corner, the host in this particular example has an IP address of 12.10.1.3. And so he tries to open a connection to port 1234 on the router. The router sees that connection attempt and it creates that address list temporary for that source IP, and it lives there for 10 seconds. Second, the same host tries to open a connection to port, that should be 4321. It then looks to see if that is in the temporary list. If it is, it adds it to the secured list. So let's talk about address lists for a moment. If you've not used address lists before in your firewall, you're really missing out. because it's a really simple way to reduce the number of rules that you have in your firewall. With address list, you simply create one rule that references the address list and then add entries to the address list to either represent the networks, the range of IPs, or the single IP host that you want that rule to be processed against. So for those of you that haven't used address lists, let's look at them just for a moment in RouterOS. You get to address list through IP firewall. And in the firewall window, there's a tab called Address List. Address lists can either be created manually, or you can create rules that will add address list entries for you dynamically. So for example, if you wanted to create an address list entry yourself, you simply hit the plus sign, you type in the name that you want the address list to be referenced by, and then you can put in either a host address or a network address there to define that particular entry. Now it's as simple as writing a firewall rule and on the Advanced tab selecting the name of the address list entry that you created. Now any host or networks that you add to that address list or more address list entries with the same name will get matched by this particular firewall rule. So with one rule, you can take the place of many, many rules. So address lists are really a cool way to create your firewalls, and they're very helpful with this port knocking strategy. So again, here's our strategy. And how do we actually configure it? Well, first of all, this relies entirely on firewall rules. So we're going to start off with IP firewall as our first step. Next, we're going to create a new firewall rule on the Filter Rules tab by clicking the plus sign. So what we're trying to do in this particular example is trap a TCP connection to port 1234. And when that occurs, put the source address, that is the client or the host that tried to open that connection, put them in an address list called temporary for 10 seconds. Now this is an example of an automatically created address list entry. Previously I showed you how you created the address list manually by hitting the plus sign and typing it in yourself. This rule, when the packet matchers are matched, will actually create the address list entry for you. If you'll notice, the action is add to source address list. The second one is the address list name, which is temporary. And then there's a timeout. In this case, I have the timeout set to 10 seconds. That means that when that address list entry is created, it will live in the list for 10 seconds. It'll have a D next to it telling you it's a dynamic entry. And once that 10 seconds times out, it goes back out of the list. The second step of the configuration is that we want to trap the opening of port 4321. And again, we want to see this time if we've already seen that connection before, if it is in our address list. Okay? So looking at the rules, on the left-hand side, we're going to create an input chain rule. The protocol is TCP. The destination port is 4321. And then one little kicker that we've added on this rule is on the Advanced tab, we look to see if the source address is already in the list called temporary. If it is, now we add the source address to a list called secured. And in this example, I let it live for 1 minute. That could be 1 minute, 1 hour, 1 day, a week, whatever you wanted to do. And then the next rule is what actually allows our client to be able to get into this router through the firewall. So the chain is input, the source address list is secured. That means that the client has been through both of the port knocking sequences, and the action is accept. So after this rule, you need one more rule to actually make this a firewall. And does anybody know, especially if you've been in my class this week, you better know, what is going to be the action for the last rule in our firewall? Drop. Oh, my heart was up in my throat. thought nobody remembered. Yeah, so the last rule in our list is a drop rule. So the chain is input and the action is drop. So this rule matches everything else. And finally, in summary, this is what our list of rules looks like. The first rule adds the source IP to a list called temporary. The second rule looks to see if they are already in the list temporary and adds them to the list secured. The third rule accepts everything from anyone in the list secured, and the last rule drops everything else. So how do you generate the NOC? Okay, so far everything we've talked about has been in RouterOS, but how do you actually generate the NOC? Well, to do it you need a NOC client. I'm sure some of you are smart enough to do it without a NOC client, but I'm not, so I looked out on the web to see what was out there. I found quite a few, some of which were homespun. I guess they were really all homespun. But some were better than others. But for my first example here, I wanted to use one that was really simple. And so what I found was on this website, and it's called just noc.exe. So the syntax is fairly simple. In Windows, from a command line, you type noc.exe, the IP address of the router that you want to NOC, the first port you want to NOC, along with the protocol, followed by a colon, and then you have to kind of wrap around the end of the screen there. The second port then, in this case 4321, and the protocol that you want to NOC. So this is a very simplistic example. We're not passing any text. We're only trying to create a port open attempt on this router. And so as you can see, we started out, we were pinging the host. It was not replying to ICMP. We did the NOC, and then the router starts replying. So now we have some period of time specified in our address list rule to actually access this router. So how can you use this? Well, one way to use it is to create your own knocking client or use one that you've downloaded from the internet to carry with you. And when you need access to a router in a secured location, you start the NOC client, you generate the NOC, the router then opens a firewall for you for some period of time, and you can get in and do what you need to do on the router. So the first question that I'm sure I'll be asked is, how effective is this? Well, because of the combination of ports and protocols that you can use and the number of possible sequences that an attacker would have to guess, the effectiveness is actually very high. So even if the hacker only knew that 2 NOCs were involved, in the very simple example that we just did, with 64,000 possible TCP, UDP, and ICMP ports, the resulting set of combinations would run into the millions. Port scanners get frustrated by port knocking because it uses closed ports to do the listening. And the biggest advantage of all is that port knocking is platform, service, and application independent. Any operating system with the correct client and server can take advantage of port knocking protection. Port knocking can also serve as an extra layer of security to protect high-risk remote management services. So if you're using remote desktop protocol, SSH, those types of things to manage your remote host, as I tell my classes, security is just a matter of applying layer upon layer. The more layers you can live with, the more security you're going to have, but as you increase the number of layers of security, the administrative burden gets higher and higher. So if you are already using fairly secure services such as SSH to manage your host, then the hacker has to get through the port knocking scheme first, and then he has to face your existing security that you have in place. So port knocking is not meant to be the only layer of security. It just adds an additional layer and an additional confounder for a potential hacker. So some ideas that I brainstormed on. to use port knocking to augment existing security services such as VPN tunnels. If you are already using VPN tunnels to get to your networks and get into your private address space, then one way you might use port knocking is to prohibit connection to the VPN service that you're running, and then require your client to actually execute the knock first. Once the knock's been executed, then they can open a VPN tunnel, and only then can they get into your network. Another way we can extend port knocking is to send some text passphrases. So not only does the hacker have to guess the sequence, the port numbers, the protocol, but now he also has to send the proper text phrases during the sequence. So in order to extend the knock, I decided to try and create my own knock client, and from a friend, Greg Soul, found out about AutoIt, who he uses quite a bit, and it's a really easy way to do your own coding and write your own application. I wouldn't even consider myself a novice with AutoIt yet, but I was able to go out on the internet, find enough examples to actually write 8 or 9 lines of code that accomplish what I wanted to accomplish. So in this example, my knock client was created with AutoIt. It's all hard-coded. It can be compiled to an exe file so that I can carry it around on a flash drive, pop it in my computer, and get into my firewall. When we're trying to watch for a series of text strings in RouterOS, we're going to use layer 7 rules to look at the strings that are sent to certain ports. And then we will change our firewall filter rules slightly to also rely on those layer 7 rules. So here's the AutoIt script, and once I upload this or send this presentation to MikroTik, you'll be able to download it from their site and then just simply copy and paste. The commands are pretty simple. The first command opens a UDP port, 1234, to the host with an IP of 10.0.1.1. And then it sends the passphrase super secret password 1. And then it closes it, opens a second connection to 4321, and sends another string of super secret password 2. So that's the AutoIt script. And then the layer 7 matchers that we have to create. I by no means am any expert on regular expressions, but again, a little bit of Googling, you can determine how to write one. So in this case, the first regular expression named, or the first layer 7 rule named knock1 looks for the expression super secret password 1. And then a second layer 7 matcher called knock2 looks for super secret password 2. And then here are the filter rules that I created. The only change is that now we are using the layer 7 matchers to look for those 2 text strings as a part of the sequence. So now, the part that I always despise about presentations, and that is doing a demonstration, because everyone knows that demonstrations never work the way you wanted them to, but we'll do our best. I have limited real estate at this particular screen resolution, so I've tried to nest things the best that I can. First of all, I'll start out with the knock client. This is what the code looks like in AutoIt. And with AutoIt, you have the ability to either run the code directly from the screen or to compile it as an exe file and run it from there. The other screen that we have open here is access to our router. In this case, since I use a Mac, I'm running Parallels virtual machine with Windows so that I can run Winbox and be in the same environment as my students usually are. In this case, I've attached to this router using the Mac Winbox feature, because right now the firewall rules are preventing me from being able to access my router using layer 3. And in this window, I have a ping going to that same router. And as you can see, the requests are timing out because I have not been secured yet. So if all goes well, what I should be able to do is to run my little piece of AutoIt code, which will generate those knocks with those passphrases, In the IP firewall address list, what you should see is 2 rules created, or 2 address list entries created, one for temporary and then one for secured. And then you should see the pings begin to run at the bottom of the screen. So we'll do it first and let you watch the pings. It's pretty simple. You just type go and you cross your fingers, and now I've been allowed access through the firewall and I can ping the device. And as you can see, there was an address list for temporary and one for secured that was created. Temporary timed out, so it went away. If I delete secured, then the ping stopped. One more time, this time I'll let you watch in Winbox as the address lists are created. So here's the compiled version. I double click it. There's the 2 address list entries. The pings start. And then the temporary one will expire and it will go away in just a moment. Questions about port knocking? Yes. We're gonna run the microphone around. Hold on.
This is a great presentation. I know I won't remember every bit of it. Is your PowerPoint presentation available online somewhere?
Yes, the PowerPoint will be available on the MikroTik site. It'll be in a PDF file, so you'll be able to copy and paste those commands into your router, and you can download AutoIt for free and copy and paste into AutoIt, and you can recreate this at home very easily.
It will be available at wiki.mikrotik.com. There is section MOM events and wiki.mikrotik.com.